As you know, Berlin has an urban fabric, which is 19th century, with courtyard buildings that touch each other on the side, party wall buildings. It also has a fabric of post-World War II slab buildings, right? Modernist buildings.
Right.
You will notice that in the slab buildings, all the units are optimized. They all have light and air, right? They all have access, they all have light and air. In the old 19th century buildings, in that courtyard, there are some very inferior units, right? They're dark, they're wet, they don't get sunlight, right? It's built into the 19th century city that there's an intrinsic differentiation in the quality of the unit. The building type forces that. It used to be that before elevators, no one wanted to live on the 6th floor, right? There was an intrinsic and famous differentiation in which actually you would get the buildings of Paris in particular, and the wealthy, some very wealthy families would live on the 2nd floor, and as they went up, they became progressively less expensive as a function of the absence of the elevator. The elevator equalized that and in some ways reversed it. You know, you want to live at the top. But nevertheless, even in Paris, in the buildings that have courtyards, back there in the rear, there's dark and wet apartments. They are a permanent source of social diversity. You don't lose the social diversity that way. So one of the things we are always confronting, the question I hear, a perennial question, is how do we not, how do we prevent gentrification of everything? When I respond that the way to prevent gentrification is to have a diversity of quality of apartment, they think I'm crazy. Oh, you mean to have bad apartments? I said, actually, not quite bad, but yeah, in that general direction. They think, you're joking. And I said, I am not joking. That is exactly why, for example, let's take an American city. You know, San Francisco has diversity, whatever you might think. So does Brooklyn. So does Miami Beach. It's because the building types generate intrinsically to them both good and bad units. The modernist slab generates only good units, or uniformly mediocre units, or uniformly bad units.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, they have no diversity. That is the kind of underlying wisdom, about what the traditional city has to offer that is only studied by the new urbanists. And everybody else is much more, not only more theoretical, but let me say, I sometimes confuse theory with absurdly idealistic positions. For me, theory and absurdly idealistic positions are almost one and the same, because what's always being proposed is this utopia. By the way, you should know that the only thing I personally design in terms of buildings is affordable housing. That's all I do personally. One affordable housing scheme after another. I find the challenge extraordinary, and always, I have to say that I've never, after many years, I've never actually prevailed. I've always been defeated. I've always from a different side. And it's really interesting. Let me tell you an example. I just did one in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And by a very close reading of the new code, the new International Building Code, I stayed completely underneath the thresholds, below which you only need one fire stair, below which you don't need an elevator, below which you don't need sprinklers. All of these things I very closely read. And I achieved some very, very nice units with 10-foot ceilings that didn't need subsidy. Amazing. They were meant to be subsidized. It was one of these incipient HUD applications. And I did it so they didn't need subsidy. When I presented, and I proudly said this doesn't need subsidy, I was witheringly attacked by the purveyors of the subsidies. Can you believe it? I was attacked. They didn't say they're purveyors of subsidy. I was attacked to the point that the agency that was in charge of getting me, of hiring me, actually lost its standing politically. And I didn't understand. And it's because there's so many people, what we call burons or suckerfish, that make a living transacting the affordable housing subsidies that we were incredibly threatening. That project has not yet died, but it may. And by the way, when we prevailed, guess what they did? I said, well, when is the RFP going to go out? They said, well, we're raising $100,000 for the RFP. $100,000 to write the RFP. They paid me $92,000 to design the whole project. Yeah. Obviously, they'd come up with one more impediment to have it happen. That is the kind of thing that I love about affordable housing. You never know where it's going to come and hit you.
And you say you want to do the community on a big scale. How do you design something? And this was one of the subjects of my last episode. How do you design something on a big scale and build in or design in enough heterogeneity that it seems realistic?
That's what we do. What we do is from the codes, all the protocols of DPZ are about downstreaming decisions. You've heard about subsidiarity, right? Mm-hmm. You know our theory of subsidiarity? Which is decisions should be made by the smallest and most local group that can competently make it at the last possible point. It's one of the reasons that we write codes instead of designing the buildings. And if you see the history of Seaside, almost like an archaeology, you will see how 100 different designers actually improved, in fact, invented the vernacular and then decanted it to Rosemary Beach and then decanted it 10 years later to Alice Beach, along with the workers and the people who knew how to sell it and the people who knew how to maintain it. All that is a result of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is the decision made, not at the highest level. Now, we sometimes have to make a lot of decisions ourselves. It doesn't mean we're just midwives of all the decisions. Some decisions are made at our level, some obviously at a higher level, but the general spirit of subsidiarity is the smallest and most local group that can competently, underline that, competently make it at the last possible moment. So for example, we certainly don't have anything to say with the design of an interior. Right? That's at the last moment done by an individual. The design of the house we download, the design of the street, the design of the neighborhood, the design of the school system, the design of the transit. All of these we assign to different levels of subsidiarity, and we have diagrams. And as soon as you find a problem or the political process going stupid on you, it's because it's being decided at the wrong level of subsidiarity. So to answer your question, it's not something that is at the edge of our concern. It's at the very center of our concern, and it has manifested itself in the intense diversity of the communities we've designed.
You have these two different kinds of trends which have run parallel to the new urbanists' rise. You have, on the one hand, things which you've highlighted, the helpful concern about public health, which plays into walkability. Environmental things, and you talked about LEED versus, I think it was DEED, where you're not only looking at buildings, but even how the neighborhood is set up. You have a number of trends which have they've played really well with new urbanism, and they have supported and undergirded what it's trying to do. You have other trends which seem to have been not as they didn't play as friendly with new urbanism, and so one of the questions would be if somebody in Seaside, which my parents have been to half a dozen times and love, by the way. If someone was in Seaside and they wanted to go to Home Depot, or if at the beginning of a Alice Beach kind of project, somebody wanted to put in a lumber yard or any kind of a economy of scale, larger retailer.
Yeah.
How does the new urbanism interface with large retail?
Perfectly well. No, that's not even a problem. That's in the transect, there are districts. Districts are specialized. When we do a plan, it's like the old industrial areas. Okay, one thing, bear this in mind. Zoning actually came into play because industry was very unhealthy, and the first action of the planning profession, which was to separate industry, was such a success that the planners became as gods. And by the way, it was that reputation that permitted them to demolish neighborhoods in the 1940s and 50s, because they had done so well making places healthy by separating industry. We no longer have unhealthy industry. We can't pollute. The workplace is absolutely healthy. Somebody else is polluting in Mexico and China, but we're not polluting. So to segregate the workplace is no longer necessary. Okay, that any zoning that says you must segregate the workplace, however, even the industrial workplace, is out of date. What you segregate now, because it's anti-urban, is the parking. The problem with the big box is not that it's useless. Like Target is just a department store. Home Depot is extremely useful, is the parking. It's the fact that it is very difficult to integrate into the urban fabric without destroying the urban fabric and making walking past it impossible. What it does is it creates a flume of unwalkability. Like if you have a walkable area and you put a Home Depot, basically people won't walk past it to the other side. So we treat those as industrial uses. We don't eliminate them. We put them in districts where they do what they do well. That's all.
I see.
And I know very well that you can't compete, that you can't, a hardware store can't compete with Home Depot. Okay? That's not a problem. Now, in France, they do it beautifully. They have a zoning. They take the core city. They take two quadrants outside the core city. 2 quadrants are for housing. 1 quadrant is for big boxes of all types, and 1 quadrant is for nature. So you have a wedge of nature coming in. So the people in the core are within very short walking distances of additional single-family dwellings, nature, or the big boxes. Or may I say driving distance in the case of big boxes, because you wouldn't want to carry this stuff anyway.
Okay, so
we do not ban big boxes. New urbanists habitually triage between 1/3 and 2/3 of wherever we are working is allocated to auto-dependent uses, which, by the way, are the new noxious uses. And until paradise is reestablished, we will always have noxious uses, but there won't be factories, they're going to be parking lots. So let's be clear.
As you and your associates are going through some of the issues that confront you in redesigning and reworking kind of what the market thus far has given you, you talked about London and 19th century urbanism and density and so forth. One of the principal components that I came to love and still love about Berlin or London or wherever is the density which an attached building makes possible. And pattern language has this whole discourse about, well, these two buildings that are right beside each other but aren't attached, they're kidding themselves. They should be put together. And I noticed that in the bulk of the new urbanism, you didn't go with the attached, but you went with the detached. I'm sure there are market forces which could explain that. This is what we've become accustomed to. There's architectural psychology. It's better to have light from 2-3 sides, which I don't have in this room right now. Which of those? I have a couple of things like that just have really intrigued me, and wondering about your thought process, how those kinds of decisions were made.
That requires a complicated answer. It's not a difficult answer. But like all things in urbanism, clarity is possible, but short answers are not. Okay? Let me just bring one example, just 2 little things that need to be considered. Those cities that you admired, the San Franciscos, the Londons, the Berlins, the car did not come in until transit was pervasive, absolutely pervasive. And therefore, they did not need at any time the provision of automobiles in a pervasive sense. And so they developed typologies that could be dense. If you were to achieve the typologies of Berlin, the densities of Berlin or London, you could not do those buildings. You would have to have buildings that were much, much, much larger just to hide the cars. They would also be more rigid, because the automobiles underneath the building or within the building are they're not very agile. They require a kind of rectangularity and so forth. So to just say, why can't we build Berlin? You'd say, well, first you need to actually at least have or promise the pervasive, both either transportation or, as in New York and London, a taxi fleet in motion. Okay, with a taxi fleet in motion, and by the way, I'm not saying it's out of the question, because Uber and other things may achieve that, you cannot actually do exactly that. So let us say that the new urbanism is different than the old urbanism, because among other things, it accommodates its own cars.
In the latest incarnation of what you're working on in lean urbanism, you're focusing on the regulations, which you're saying are keeping people like me or people like I'd like to become, the generalists.
Yeah.
From doing things that are value add to society, so to speak. And I knew about that, and then when I came into this program to study development, or so I thought, I realized that in the last 30 years, real estate has become very institutionalized because pension funds and sovereign wealth funds are diversifying, and they have $800 billion, and they say, well, we're going to give 10%, which is $80 billion, to real estate. Suddenly, everyone who's studying real estate is studying banking by a different name, essentially.
Right.
And so a lot of the people in my program are very interested in things which look much more like banking to me than development through my, starter set of spectacles. So whether it's because of the regulations or which is what you've been focusing on, which is I think a definite issue, or because of the institutionalization and people want to work at banks and people want to work at capital and private equity as opposed to develop things.
Yeah.
What advice would you have to people? I know this is kind of more of a wrap-up question, but what advice would you have to people who are trying to become those generalists?
I think that what you said is very, very accurate. That in the past, I wouldn't say in the past 30 years, I'd say possibly in the past 10 years, it has become the way you describe it. I often try to remember what my original clients were, and they had a good streak of idealism. The planning profession, the development profession, surprising, might be astounding to you, but really wanted to make the world better.
Right.
I think that developers constantly and without any cynicism, even the Levittown developers, try to make the world better. And in the past 10, 15 years, my own clients, and my clients are the top of the heap, okay? They're the smartest. We put them through a very sort of rigorous, I think, mutual interview. We have the smartest clients, but they're essentially accountants. The way they're forced to keep score by the people who are placing the large loans, these institutions on automatic protocols, force them to have returns that are closer to selling widgets. So how many houses do I sell, or how do I set this up to flip the project, so that on the books it looks like I might have a 300% return. And although they remain perfectly humane when you meet them, they're fantastic people. Developers are very interesting people. They're generalists. They take risks. They take tremendous risks. They have to know a lot of different things. They're not like doctors and lawyers that I find instantaneously boring. But developers are always interesting people. And yet, the new developer, while retaining that intelligence, their hands are so tied by the financial system that you know very well, that it's as if they have lost 60, 80 points of IQ. When the decision finally comes down and the decisions have to be made, there is some impersonal protocol way back at some Boston bank that prevents it. There is some fund in California that prevents the application of intelligence. All I can say is that I am glad I started when I did. I don't think things are getting better. I'm very glad I saw some of the old regime. I'm sorry I missed the very first generation. They seem to have gotten an incredible amount done. The late 19th century, early 20th century, pre-war, fantastic sort of power and ability could be applied with almost no impediments. But I saw the tail end of that, and I generally practiced with some chance of idealism, which I think is pretty much gone. What's going to confuse you is that developers have never been nicer and smarter. The personality is there. But when it comes down to making the decision, I'm still flabbergasted at how stupid they become because of the extraneous protocols that have been applied. And I think what you need to do is to bypass that whole thing. They're dinosaurs now. One way to think about it is they're dinosaurs. And what we're interested in lean urbanism is the many mammals. They still have the same biomass. And it's an analogy you've heard me make. A REIT is a magnificent beast, but it needs to find, all by itself, it needs to find 2 tons of fodder a day, or it dies. While a chipmunk needs 2 acorns a day, and in a decentralized way can actually achieve the same biomass. But it's also very far from what is the real play in development, which is appreciation. Appreciation is taking a piece of land that's worth X, and by intelligent maneuvering on it, by implanting infrastructure, by bringing the right people in, the right programs, by building architecture of quality, the same land doubles, triples, quadruples in price. And that there's a factor of time there. that can neither be analyzed by the people with the billions of dollars, nor can they wait for it. So real estate development, the land that made San Francisco and other parts of the West, let us say, interchangeable with any other piece of land, this vast open continent. Those who made specific places in this vast and open continent valuable and made fortunes at it, that's not in play. That's not even understood.